Hey everyone, MsStoryMystery here. Welcome to episode 38. Tonight, we're diving into some truly creepy and paranormal experiences. These are real encounters, from haunted houses to eerie late night encounters. Settle in, turn down the lights if you dare, and let's explore these mysteries together. When I was little, I had this incredible modern dollhouse made up of stackable room cubes. I could arrange them in all sorts of ways, sometimes even stacking them taller than me. Honestly, I spent more time rearranging the rooms and tiny furniture than actually playing with it. But my bedroom, that was a different story. Something about it never felt quite right. It had plenty of sunshine, two big windows, and soft sage green walls. My mom even decorated it with a fairy theme to make it feel warm and inviting. And yet, it always felt off. Both of my older sisters had the room before me, and neither of them could stand it. They both ended up moving to the loft instead. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe it had something to do with the family ghost stories tied to that room. Stories that started long before I was born. One afternoon, I was sitting on the floor, completely absorbed in my dollhouse. I had stacked the cubes so high that I couldn't see past them. That's when I felt it. A shift in the air. That unmistakable feeling that someone had just entered the room. A heavy, almost suffocating presence settled around me, and I knew I wasn't alone. My stomach dropped, and I could feel my pulse in my ears. I didn't dare look up, afraid of what I might see. Instead, I peeked through the tiny window of the kitchen cube, hoping, praying that there was nothing there. But there was. Through that tiny window, I saw a small child's hand, just resting there. And below it, the hem of a plaid dress, red, tan, and blue. Whoever she was on the other side of the dollhouse looking down at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I didn't want to see her face. Slowly, I squeezed my eyes shut and backed out of the room inch by inch until I reached the hallway. And then I bolted. I found my mom, heart pounding, words caught in my throat. She barely even looked up before saying, "Saw something, didn't you? If you don't want to see them anymore, you don't have to." I didn't ask how she knew. I didn't question it. I just knew I never wanted to see them again. And from that day on, I didn't. The strange feelings, the heavy presence, they were just gone. I still don't know why, but I never saw her again. So this happened about 6 years ago. At the time, I was working at a bar, which meant I usually got off work pretty late, around 3 a.m. Since I lived nearby, I always walked home after my shift. There were two different routes I could take. One was along a busy street lined with bars and clubs, packed with people even that late at night. The other was a quieter, darker route that always felt a little eerie, but I often chose it just to avoid the crowds. That night, I was exhausted and just wanted to get home, so I went with the quieter path. As I was walking, a group of drunk guys appeared ahead of me, blocking my way. I made it clear I wasn't interested in talking, and after a few awkward moments, they let me pass. But as I walked away, I noticed a taxi parked nearby. The driver had clearly seen what had happened, because he rolled his window down and asked if I needed a ride. I told him no, I wasn't far from home, but he insisted, saying he wouldn't charge me. At that moment, I convinced myself he was just being nice, looking out for someone walking alone that late. And against all common sense, I got in. As we started driving, he asked for my address. I even offered to pay him, but he waved it off. Everything seemed fine until we got close to my place. Instead of stopping, he kept driving. I immediately asked where he was going. He acted like it was a mistake, saying he was just trying to find a place to turn around. But instead of turning, he kept driving, taking me further and further away until we ended up in an industrial area, a dead-end road with no one around. At this point, my stomach dropped. My phone had died earlier, and I had no way to call for help. My mind was racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Well, this is the perfect spot for you to turn around." He hesitated, and for a second, I swear I could feel him debating something. But then, just like that, he nodded, muttered that I was right, and turned the car around. He drove me back to my place without another word. The second I stepped out of that car, my heart was racing. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't spoken up the way I did, and honestly, I don't even know why I got in the car to begin with. It was a stupid, reckless decision. But in the end, I got lucky. Really, really lucky. I've heard my husband tell this story a dozen times, and no matter how many times I hear it, it still makes my skin crawl. He's not one to scare easily, but I can always tell by the way he talks about that job. Something wasn't right out there. He used to work for a water transfer company, moving water through miles of high-density pipeline for fracking. It was an isolated job out in the middle of nowhere, usually just him, a roaring compressor, a few lights, and sometimes a truck if he was lucky. No cell service, just a barely working radio to call the next guy up the chain if something went wrong. There was one particular site, down in a valley next to a creek, where everyone on the crew had weird experiences. Some nights, my husband would hear strange crashes in the woods. Sometimes it was faint, like something just watching from the tree line. Other nights it was loud, branches snapping, something moving just beyond the reach of lights. But none of that compared to what happened to his co-worker, Jake. Jake had been stationed at that site alone one night. The pumps were off and everything was still. Just the occasional rustle of the trees, the creek moving in the dark. Then, out of nowhere, he heard something crashing through the woods. Something big. He grabbed his spotlight and scanned the tree line, but he couldn't see anything. And then it let out a roar. Not just any roar. Jake said it was so deep and powerful that he felt it in his chest, like his ribs were vibrating. It was so loud it shook his truck's mirrors. And before he could even process what was happening, a massive log came flying out of the woods and slammed into the front of his truck. He didn't stick around. He radioed up to my husband's buddy, who was a mile up the hill, and begged him to come pick him up. He was shaking when they got back to the main site, saying he almost threw up from how scared he was. After that, nobody went to that site alone again. But whatever it was out there, it wasn't done. A few weeks later, another crew had been hearing strange noises. More crashes in the woods, more uneasy feelings. So, they adjusted the lights on the work site, pointing them directly into the trees. The very next night, during a routine crew change, just a 30 to 45-minute window where nobody was around, they came back to find the entire light plant had been pushed into the creek. It was completely wrecked. Now, maybe a group of people could have done that, but who? And why? And if it was people, that meant they were lurking out there all the time, just waiting. The last straw happened when another one of my husband's longtime co-workers, someone who doesn't scare easily, had to go back to that site one evening to pick up a piece of equipment. He went alone. The second he stepped out of his truck, he knew something was off. He said he had this gut-wrenching feeling like he was being watched. Not just watched, like he wasn't supposed to be there. He tried to ignore it, hurried to get the equipment attached, and jumped back into his truck. And then he saw it. As he pulled away, just 4 feet from his truck, standing at the edge of the trees, was a massive, hulking black figure. It was watching him. He said he had never been so terrified in his life. After that, nobody wanted to go back down there. And my husband, he was glad when that job was finally over. This wasn't a scary experience, but to this day, I still can't explain it. I've never seen a ghost, but I've experienced one more than once, and this is one of those times. Back in 2009, my husband and I were living with my grandfather and great aunt in the house I grew up in. My grandmother had passed a few years earlier, and I didn't want my grandpa to have to sell the house or live alone, so we moved in to keep him company. That house held so many wonderful memories and a few tragedies, but I digress. Every Wednesday night, my great aunt would go to bingo. She loved it. That week, my grandfather decided to tag along just to see what all the fuss was about. And honestly, it would have been crazy for him to turn her down. She was a walking good luck charm. So my husband and I stayed home, just hanging out in the living room, which was right above my great aunt's apartment in the basement. We had the TV on, hockey I think, and like we always did, we muted the commercials. Streaming services weren't really a thing back then, so you just had to sit through them or tune them out. And that's when we heard it. A soft humming coming from downstairs. At first, we thought nothing of it. Figured maybe my great aunt was just in a singing mood. But then I heard something that made me freeze. My nickname, Mimi. Not many people call me that. It was a name only a few close family members used. Thinking maybe she needed something, I got up and went into the kitchen, where we had this little square window overlooking the basement staircase. That was also her entrance, so I leaned out and called, "Yes, Auntie?" Silence. I went back to the living room, and my husband asked if she answered. I shook my head, but then we both heard it again. Her voice calling my name. At that point, we were confused. She should be at bingo. Maybe she forgot something? Maybe my grandpa did? So I went downstairs to check. Nobody. I knocked on her door, listened. Nothing. I went back upstairs, and the second I walked in, my husband turned to me and said, "She's humming again." Now we were really baffled. I grabbed him and we went into the kitchen, looking out the window that overlooked the driveway. Empty. Except for my husband's car, there was no one home. But we both heard her voice, humming, singing, and calling my name clear as day. It was eerie, yeah, but honestly, it was kind of fun. Ghosts aren't always scary. Sometimes they're just playful. My great aunt came home later that night with my grandpa, and we told her what happened. She was spooked, but we already knew there was something in that house. And that night, it decided to borrow her voice. Let me tell you about the house I grew up in. A house that, to this day, still makes me question what I believe about the paranormal. Nothing like it has ever happened to me before or since. But that place, it changed everything. When my parents first bought the house in upstate New York, my dad was working at a nearby music store. He used to see this old man come in from time to time, kind of mysterious, always wearing a necklace strung with little bones. My dad was in his 20s, into punk music, and thought the whole thing was fascinating. One day, he asked the guy about it. "The bones are real," the man said. My dad, always one to push a joke, laughed and told him, "Well, I want a human skull." The old man didn't laugh. He just nodded and said, "I can get you one." Of course, my dad brushed it off. Weeks passed and he forgot all about it, until the guy actually came back. And this time, he had a skull, a real one. My dad thought it was some kind of joke, so naturally, he brought it home. My mom, who was superstitious to begin with, was absolutely furious and demanded he get rid of it. But instead of throwing it away, my dad just stuck it in the basement and moved on with his life. That's when things started to get weird. My aunt swears she once caught a glimpse of my toddler brother sitting in the hallway, except he wasn't alone. A little girl was behind him, holding him gently. My mom also said she had seen this girl before, just lingering in the house. She thought she was imagining things at first. Then the nightmares started. My mom would wake up in a panic, convinced there were shadowy figures standing by her bed. Sometimes she'd be terrified that men were hiding in the closet, but by morning, she wouldn't even remember it. And then there was me. When I was about 5, I started having intense night terrors. Sometimes I would sleepwalk. One night, my mom woke with a start. She just knew something was wrong. She ran to my room and found my bed empty. She searched the house, and when she finally found me, I was sitting cross-legged in front of the TV. The screen was off, but I was staring at it like I was watching something. "What are you doing?" she asked. Without looking away, I said, "Watching my show. I want to go outside and play with my friends." I don't remember any of this, but she scooped me up and put me back to bed. Other things happened too. My brother messed around with a Ouija board once, and later swore he saw my mom sitting up in bed, eyes wide open, staring straight ahead. He tried talking to her, but she just laid back down like nothing happened. We all heard footsteps on the stairs when no one was there. Knocking on the walls became so common, we almost stopped noticing. Then my parents got divorced, and my mom finally decided to leave the house for good. The day we moved out, a garbage truck came to haul away the last of the junk from the basement. My dad, who had long since forgotten about the skull, never found it. It was just gone. There was no tragic history tied to the house, no unsolved mysteries, no famous hauntings. We even met the woman whose father had built it in the 80s, and aside from her family, we were the only ones who'd ever lived there. And yet, the last time I stepped foot into that house, I felt something. Something that told me to run. So I did, and I never looked back. Now my mom and I sleep peacefully, and whatever was in that house, it stayed behind. I was 7 when my family moved into a house that everyone said was haunted. Before we lived there, my friends and I used to pass it on our way to school. It had been empty for years. The grass was so tall it looked like a jungle, and the driveway was cracked and crumbling. It just had that eerie, abandoned look. One summer day, my friend and I got curious. We decided to check it out, thinking it would be fun to mess around. For whatever reason, we thought it'd be cool to break a window. So we smashed a sliding glass door and peeked inside. The second we did, we both felt it. A deep, icy chill that didn't belong on a hot summer day. Something about it was just wrong. We got out of there fast. A few months later, my parents told me we were moving. I was excited to see our new place, so I hopped in the truck with them. But when we pulled into the driveway, my heart dropped. It was that house. At first, I panicked, thinking they somehow knew about the broken window when I was about to get in serious trouble. But they didn't say a word about it, just acted like it was any other move. It was such a bizarre coincidence, but I didn't dare bring it up. My stepdad got to work fixing the place up, but no matter what he did, the house always felt off. It was cold inside, even in the middle of summer. The layout made no sense. There was a basement kitchen and this weird L-shaped hallway that led to nowhere. Not long after we moved in, strange things started happening. One morning, I was lying in bed with the covers over my head when I felt something hit me on my face, hard, like a fist coming down on me. I yanked the blankets back, expecting to see my brother messing with me, but there was no one there. I tried to shake it off, but the uneasy feeling stuck with me. After a while, I started to feel like something in that house really didn't like me. Maybe it was because of what I'd done to the windows before we'd moved in. I don't know. But one day, as I was heading down to the basement, I felt a sharp shove against my back. I lost my balance and tumbled off the last couple of steps. I spun around expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. It happened again not long after. Same spot, same hard shove. I was too freaked out to tell anyone, afraid they'd think I was making it up. A few months later, my stepdad admitted that something weird had happened to him too. While he was retiling the bathroom, he saw a face in the tiles, but it wasn't his own reflection. It was someone else's. That was the moment we all started to realize something about that house wasn't right. Eventually, we moved out, and for years I barely thought about the place. Then one day I told my wife the whole story, and she wanted to go see the house for herself. When we got there, nothing had changed. It looked just as abandoned as it had all those years ago. The grass still overgrown, the driveways still falling apart. Recently, I drove by and saw signs that someone might be living there now. I can't help but wonder if they've experienced anything strange. I'd love to ask, but I don't want to scare them. And that's all for episode 38 of MsStoryMystery. Thank you for joining me this evening. I hope these stories gave you chills and made you wonder what else might be lurking just out of sight. If you had a good time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Every little bit helps this community grow. Until next time, stay curious and maybe keep a light on.